Peace with Spain in 1588 triggered a period of cultural renaissance and nationalism in England and an open door to the New World. But that didn't mean the people of England were ready to repeat its failures at Roanoke. A person would have had to have been desperate to put their lives on the line, cross the Atlantic, and face harsh conditions of the American wilderness. In this segment, we will discuss why Jamestown was colonized and what it was like there during the first years of settlement. New World crops meant Europeans were better fed than in any time previously in history. Relative peace and stability during Elizabeth's reign led to a population boom in England. In a short 50 years, the population of the island grew by 1 million souls. Textile manufacturing made wool prices soar. English landlords, greedy to make money, evicted their peasant farmers and fenced off croplands to make room for more pasture. What resulted was an economic depression that ultimately provided the desperation needed to colonize Virginia. When overproduction of wool eventually dropped prices, landlords tried to compensate for their lost profits by producing more wool, dropping prices even further. They reacted by putting pressure on their tenants by charging them steep rents. Without the ability to make money from wool and prohibited from farming, many tenants wound up in debtors' prisons because they were unable to pay. This economic depression left thousands of Englishmen starving, homeless, imprisoned, and desperate for work. At the same time, English laws of primogeniture meant there was an entire body of ambitious younger sons that were unable to depend on their family's wealth to support them in the way that they had become accustomed. From this disinherited class of men, a new economic system arose. In a feudal society, a person can rarely advance themselves socially, but a joint stock company, the precursor to a modern-day corporation, allowed men willing to labor in a colony to share profits with investors willing to charter this adventure. The stage was now set for a historic effort to establish an English colony in the American wilderness. Hoping to strike it rich, like the Spanish 100 years prior, King James I granted permission in 1606 to the Virginia Company to establish a temporary colony. Members of the Virginia Company, both laborers and their gentlemen overseers, were guaranteed the same rights of Englishmen that they would have enjoyed at home. This is a remarkable moment in American history because colonists like Thomas Jefferson would later charge that the Crown violated their English rights as they neared closer to the American Revolution in the 18th century. On May 24th, 1607, about 100 Englishmen, all of them men, On May 24th, 1607, about 100 English settlers, all of them men, neared a salty backwater marsh on the Chesapeake Bay. They called their new colony Jamestown after their king. The early years of Jamestown were a nightmare. 40 colonists died on the initial voyage from England. Settlers to Jamestown died by the droves. Grave sites excavated by archaeologists often The early years of Jamestown were a nightmare. 40 colonists died on the initial voyage from England. Settlers to Jamestown died by the dozens. Grave sites excavated by archaeologists often hold more than one body. And though the forest and bay were full of wild game, starvation killed many because gentlemen overseers refused to work and demanded that the laborers spend their time digging for non-existent gold. In 1608, the colony's leader, Bartholomew Gosnold, died. Its members chose John Smith, a man that had made the initial voyage to Virginia in chains, as his replacement. It was Smith that saved Virginia from utter collapse. First and foremost, Smith instituted a policy that forbade anyone that was unwilling to work from eating. Smith's popularity with his men began a year prior when he was kidnapped by the Smith's popularity with his men began a year prior when he was kidnapped by the local Indian tribe, the English named after their local. Smith's popularity with his men began a year prior when he was kidnapped by the local Indian tribe, the English named after their leader, Chief Powhatan. In a demonstration of force, Powhatan had ordered Smith's execution, but the execution was stopped by the chief's daughter, Pocahontas. While this event was most likely choreographed to display the chief's power, Pocahontas became a translator for the English, and Smith worked with her to gain the aid for the hopeless colony. Still, Smith had enemies. While the perpetrator remains a mystery, Smith was shot in the leg and forced to return to England. His success as Jamestown's commander speaks for itself. Only 60 of the 400 people in Jamestown survived the winter after Smith's departure. Colonists were reduced to eating cats, rats, dogs, mice, poisonous snakes, and each other. One man was put to death for killing and cannibalizing his wife. This is an image of Pocahontas, though probably not as you envisioned her. Pocahontas married famous English planter John Rolfes, who's best known for establishing a strain of tobacco that was wildly popular with English people. Pocahontas journeyed to England, where she was received as a princess. While she was preparing to return, she died, but her infant son ultimately reached Virginia, where hundreds of his descendants have lived, including the second Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. A population boom and an economic depression provided England with the laborers it would need to establish its first permanent colonies. The wool industry had put many A population boom and an economic depression provided England with the laborers it would need to establish its first permanent colonies. The wool industry had put many tenant farmers on the streets and in debtors' prisons. Many of the English colony's first laborers came from this unhappy lot. The Depression also motivated some landless aristocrats to invest in joint stock companies that would establish for-profit colonies in Virginia. These well-to-do members of England's society journeyed to the New World as gentlemen overseers who intended to make sure that their investment paid dividends in gold. Disease, starvation, and conflict with natives killed nearly 85% of the Jamestown settlers. If not for the efforts of Captain John Smith, Pocahontas, and the Powhatan Indians, Jamestown would have gone the way of Roanoke.